Just as he told Sky News last week, the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown explains in The Guardian why he thinks citizens' assemblies are the only way to break the Brexit deadlock. Elsewhere in that newspaper, John Harris warns that there's a growing appetite amongst the English for a no-deal Brexit. He points out that the idea of no deal got a roar of approval on last week's Question Time. The former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson makes the same point at the end of his weekly Telegraph column. He also insists that the Prime Minister can yet unite her party by ditching the backstop. Below that column, some good news from Mrs May from her New Zealand counterpart, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. She says New Zealand is ready to form an ambitious trade agreement with the UK, no matter how Brexit plays out. And Boris Johnson gets a mention in Claire Foge's piece in The Times, in which she calls for party discipline and accuses MPs of self-obsession. In the Eye, Ian Birrell writes that although the idea of a snap election should be a bad joke, the Tories may just call one in the belief that Jeremy Corbyn can't win it. Well, The Guardian's cartoon shows Theresa May doing anything but taking back control. Neither is she in control in The Telegraph, where she's replaced Prince Philip at the steering wheel. And in The Times, the Prime Minister insists she's listening in spite of plugging her ears with red lines. Well, joining me to look at those today are the Telegraph columnist Juliet Samuel and Sonia Sodha, chief leader writer of The Observer. Welcome to you both. Let's talk a little bit about that column in The Guardian about sort of English nationalism that John Harris is writing about. I just heard Bernard Jenkins say, oh yeah, this is the top option in the polls, about 28% of people saying it, that they would favour a no-deal Brexit. Is that where we're heading, do you think?
I hadn't thought so until recently. I mean, I still think that somehow a deal will get through that's basically very similar to the Prime Minister's deal. But I think that, I mean, you know, the default legislative position is that we leave without a deal, with or without a deal on March 29th. And it's getting harder and harder to see how the parliamentary maths adds up to avoid that outcome. And I think that you have a certain groundswell in the country of support for that because people believe that the EU has been extremely difficult. But whether they're prepared to deal with what the potential consequences are, whether it's an inflation spike or disruption to trade, that's another question.
I mean, that's the paradox, isn't it? That a lot of experts, politicians have said, look, the consequences of no deal will be pretty severe. Yet there seems to be, 1 in 4 of us now saying, well, I don't care, I still want to get out.
Yeah, but we shouldn't sort of, 1 in 4 is 1 in 4. It's not, you know, if it was 60% or 70% of the public saying they were really in favour of a no-deal option, that might be a bit different. But 1 in 4 isn't exactly a sort of huge majority out there in the country. And I think, yes, you're right, there is this sort of dichotomy between, you know, people who think a no deal is just, you know, we've just got to get out now. And you can, you know, as John Harris argues in his piece, you can sort of sense people's exasperation after sort of that it's taken this long. But the whole problem is that people were promised something in a referendum campaign. We can leave quickly, easily, Britain will do great as a result. That just hasn't transpired.
But the point is there isn't much buyer's remorse, and you've now got Boris Johnson who's espoused this, espouses it in his column, just had Bernard Jenkins sitting there that, you know, he doesn't have a problem with it. These claims that there are already deals on paper that would make it better, I mean, are there?
There are some. I mean, it's pretty incomplete, but you've got a deal on aviation, and you would have to pretty quickly strike some other deals on road haulage or regulatory checks.
But I mean, for example, I read today on aviation, they've capped the number of flights, so there wouldn't be any increase in UK-based flights to Europe, for example, which are planned for at the moment.
Right. Well, there might not be an increase, but the stuff that is going on right now would continue. So you wouldn't have this situation with, you know, planes sitting on the tarmac. But I think one of the things that's hardening people's views, at least as a Remainer who then, you know, said, well, we should do the Brexit result, at least I can feel for myself, and I think that this is what's happening in the country, is that the closer we get to the idea that Parliament or whoever it is will arrange some stitch-up to stop Brexit from happening, I think that hardens people's position to say, well, let's just get out of this, because if we don't do it now, we never will. And the whole referendum that we argued over for months and months and that became so vicious will have become a pointless exercise. And I personally would rather have no deal than no Brexit, and I'm someone who voted Remain. So I think that one thing that's valuable about John Harris's piece is that he's bursting this London bubble, the idea that people have changed their minds. They haven't changed their minds. They're just hardening their positions.
I don't, there's not a lot of evidence that lots and lots of people have switched, but I do think, a no-deal Brexit would be absolutely terrible for the country, and it would create so much more backlash against politicians and the political class. And I think even staying in the EU, if we had a second referendum and if there was a narrow majority in favour of staying in, people say, well, that will create popular backlash. I think the impact of a no-deal, on areas of the country that have really suffered as a result of deindustrialisation for the last 30 years, the government's own analysis shows that the impact of a no-deal Brexit would be
but they're the people
most strongly felt by some of the
places where the majority backed Brexit, and as far as we can tell, they still do.
That is true, and that is one of these paradoxes, but MPs have to do as well what they feel is right by their constituents, and this is why some Labour MPs are in an incredibly difficult position, because they know that if we were to have a no-deal Brexit, the impact on their areas, on their local economies would be really catastrophic, and would create a big backlash. The deal, you can see why Labour MPs don't want to vote for the deal. I think actually one of the most interesting constructive suggestions, and hopefully we'll come on to discuss it, is one of this idea around a citizen.
This is Gordon Brown's idea. I was just about to ask you about that.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and I think it could sort of pave the way for a referendum, but in a way that has much more, if it's what people who take part in these assemblies want, but in a sort of more constructive way, I suppose. But I think the problem with the debate at the moment is that people were promised a fantasy 2 years ago. There's a lot of kind of stuff flying around. There's lots of politicians saying things about a no deal that just don't hold up. Well, the advantage of a citizens' assembly is you get people in a room. People are actually incredibly reasonable when they're presented with facts and evidence, and you ask them about the trade-offs rather than having politicians like Boris Johnson saying there are no trade-offs here. We can have our cake and eat it.
This is the idea espoused by Stella Creasy, the Labour MP, now being put forward by Gordon Brown. What he's saying is, first of all, delay Brexit. Secondly, have these consultative assemblies, and then thirdly, possibly have a referendum at the end once they reach a conclusion. And it's modelled on what happened in Ireland over abortion, where the assemblies at least designed the question. What do you think?
Well, in Ireland, they didn't have the vote and then say, actually, we don't like the results, so we're going to have a load of consultations. What this sounds like to me is basically another referendum campaign. And, we had town hall meetings, we had debates, we had rallies, we had gatherings, and the country made a decision. And we should now implement it. And the idea that then we're now going to go back and have these wonderful meetings with everyone's views having hardened, a vicious debate having happened, and that we're all going to get together and agree on a consensus in a town hall.
I think that misunderstands what citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies are about. So this idea that we are highly polarised, there's absolutely no way that British people can come together. I think actually
it's a bit nerdy, though, isn't it?
I agree. It's quite hard. I agree, and that's a real problem for the idea. It's quite hard to explain. It sounds a little bit, sort of, just sort of fantasy politics in some way. But we know they've worked in other countries around other issues. And the fact is, when you get people together, we are all quite naturally reasonable people. When we see there are tough trade-offs,
that's the problem.
But the problem is that there was a decision, but it wasn't a decision about leaving the EU in a particular way. It was a vague question. People were presented with a fantasy. They were essentially lied to by politicians like Boris Johnson, like Nigel Farage, like Jacob Rees-Mogg. They were misled. They were told untruths in that campaign. So I think actually, putting it in front of people and getting them to have a discussion with facts and evidence and saying, right, you come up with some recommendations that go to MPs in Parliament. I think it becomes very difficult if you've got a group of people, groups of people across the country who said, we see this way through the trade-off, and that goes to MPs. It becomes quite difficult for politicians to ignore
We're going to leave it there. There is one argument that says Parliament's a citizens' assembly anyway, isn't there? But thank you very much.
You should just vote for the deal.
This is All Out Politics. Coming up next, will Theresa May's Plan B be enough to change the mind of MPs?